What if I told you that one of Christianity's most famous apostles, the man who wrote half the New Testament, vanished from the historical record for 6 entire years? Not just a few months or a single year, but 6 full years during the prime of his ministry. And what if the answer to this mystery lies not in the sun-baked deserts of the Middle East, but in the misty hills of ancient Britain? I am your host Alan, and this is the extraordinary story of St. Paul's lost years, and it's far stranger and more compelling than most people realize. When you read through the book of Acts and Paul's epistles, something peculiar emerges. After Paul arrives in Rome, there are gaps, significant, unexplained gaps in the timeline. For a man whose movements were otherwise meticulously documented, whose letters provide us with itineraries and travel plans, these silences are deafening. 6 years, to be precise. 6 years where one of history's most important religious figures simply disappears from the pages of Scripture. Where was he? What was he doing? And why did the biblical writers leave this chapter of his life unrecorded? For centuries, scholars have puzzled over these questions. But a fascinating body of evidence, both historical and traditional, suggests an answer that seems almost fantastical. Paul spent those missing years in Gaul and Britain, preaching the gospel to the Celtic peoples at the very edge of the known world. Welcome to Uncovered Biblical History and Traditions, the channel dedicated to lost stories of the biblical past. Discover stories of pre-Christian historical roots, biblical legends, lost church history, and forgotten historical characters of faith. It is very helpful if you hit the like, subscribe, and share. Help build my channel, and let's take a look together into these uncovered forgotten tales. The conventional narrative of early Christianity focuses on the Mediterranean world, Jerusalem, Antioch, Rome. These were the centers of civilization, the hubs of the Roman Empire. But what if Christianity's reach extended far beyond what we've been taught? Around AD 61, historical records place Paul returning to Rome from Cambria, the ancient name for Wales. Following his release from his first Roman imprisonment, evidence suggests he embarked on journeys that took him along the Aurelian Way from Rome to Arles in Gaul. French historian Édouard de Bazilaire traced this route in detail, documenting Paul's travels around AD 62. Paul didn't travel alone. With him were companions whose names appear in his epistles: Trophimus, who had been part of an earlier missionary band, and Crescens, whom Paul sent to Vienne. Crescens would go on to found the church at Mayence, modern-day Mainz, Germany, and become its first bishop. Intriguingly, Paul's letters reference leaving a sick disciple behind in Gaul, providing scriptural corroboration for his presence in the region. But it's what happened in Britain that truly captures the imagination. Listen to what the Reverend R.W. Morgan wrote about this period. There are 6 years of St. Paul's life to be accounted for, between his liberation from his first imprisonment and his martyrdom at Aquae Salviae in the Ostian Road, near Rome. Part certainly, the greater part perhaps, of this period was spent in Britain, in Siluria or Cambria, beyond the bounds of the Roman Empire, and hence the silence of the Greek and Latin writers upon it. This is the key insight. Paul was operating outside the boundaries of Roman jurisdiction. He was in Siluria, a region in southern Wales, and throughout Cambria, lands that lay beyond the reach of Roman historians. The Greek and Latin writers who documented so much of the ancient world had no access to events unfolding in these distant Celtic territories. The silence in the historical record wasn't because nothing was happening, it was because it was happening beyond the horizon of Roman civilization. Think about the audacity of this mission. Paul, a Roman citizen who could have remained comfortably within the empire's protected boundaries, instead ventured into tribal Britain. This wasn't the Romanized Britain of cities and villas that would emerge centuries later. This was the Britain of warrior tribes, of druids, of people the Romans considered barbarians. If you would like further context and the rest of the story, check out previous videos and future videos. If you would like more information where to research this subject, pause this image and look into these resources or find resources in description. If you have book sources or links of your own on this subject, please share in comments or email me. While the memory of Paul's ministry in Wales and Gaul has largely faded, lost to time, oral traditions gone silent, records destroyed or never made, in England, remarkable memorials remain. The most striking of these is in London itself. The city that the Welsh called Llandon earned a designation that directly links it to Paul's most famous sermon. It was known as the Areopagus of Britain. Just as Paul had stood on Mars Hill in Athens, the Areopagus, addressing the philosophers and citizens of that great city, tradition holds that he preached from the summit of Ludgate Hill in London. This wasn't just a casual connection drawn by imaginative historians. The designation arose from a specific historical event. That hilltop, chosen for its prominence and accessibility, became sacred in Christian memory. And on that very spot, centuries later, would rise one of the world's most iconic religious buildings, St. Paul's Cathedral. The cathedral isn't just named after Paul as a generic tribute to a famous apostle. It marks the location where he is believed to have proclaimed the gospel to the British people for the first time. Within the cathedral grounds stands St. Paul's Cross, an ancient monument that may mark the exact spot where the apostle stood, the physical marker of where Christianity first took root in British soil. The connection between Paul and London became so deeply embedded in the city's identity that Paul was designated the patron saint of London. His emblem, the Sword of Martyrdom, commemorating his execution, was incorporated into London's official coat of arms, where it remains to this day. This great metropolis carries the symbol of an apostle's sacrifice as part of its very identity. Of course, skeptics raise an obvious question: how could Paul communicate with the ancient Britons? What language would he have used? It's a fair question, and the answer is more fascinating than you might expect. Paul had multiple options, and the British would have understood him through any of them. The ancient British were familiar with Greek on a large scale. It served as the international language of the era, much like English does today. Paul wrote all his epistles in Greek, and it remained the language of the Church of Rome for an extended period after the apostolic age. If Paul used Greek, which he certainly could, his British audiences would have understood him perfectly. Then there's Latin. Among the educated classes in Britain, Latin was well known. We have dramatic proof of this. When the British king Caractacus was brought to trial in Rome, he addressed the Roman Senate directly in Latin. If British nobility possessed this level of linguistic sophistication, neither Paul nor his audiences would have faced any difficulty in communication. The bottom line: language was no barrier whatsoever. But here's what makes this story even more interesting: Paul wouldn't have wanted to preach in a language his audience didn't understand. From the very beginning, Christian practice emphasized reading scripture in the vulgar tongue, the common language of the people. This wasn't innovation, it aligned with Druidic custom, which had always emphasized vernacular communication. The British already valued native language worship. More importantly, it was biblical mandate. In 1 Corinthians chapter 14 verse 9, Paul himself established the principle for the church. He wrote, "If I know not the meaning of the voice, I shall be unto him that speaketh a barbarian, and he that speaketh shall be a barbarian unto me. I had rather in the church speak 5 words with my understanding, than 10,000 words in an unknown tongue." Paul prioritized intelligibility over formality, communication over ritual. The idea that he would preach to the British in a language they couldn't understand contradicts everything he taught. This makes what happened centuries later all the more tragic. During Charlemagne's reign, Latin became the language of church services throughout much of Europe. By AD 600, Pope Gregory I decreed that Latin would be the mandatory language of prayer and worship across all lands under papal jurisdiction. The British Church opposed this practice from the beginning. They maintained their commitment to vernacular worship, continuing the tradition from apostolic times. They were the first to demand the abolition of mandatory Latin in worship, the first to print the Bible in their own language, and the first to preach the Bible in the native tongue. They were pioneers of the vernacular scripture movement, not because they were innovators, but because they were preserving what Paul had established. The irony is profound. The church that received its Christianity directly from an apostle had to fight to maintain apostolic practice against later Roman Catholic innovations. And Latin wasn't the only innovation. According to Bishop Ussher's Historia Dogmatica, the worship of images and relics was first introduced in a Roman Church council by Pope Hadrian I in AD 788, a practice the Bible calls idolatry and explicitly condemns in Exodus and Deuteronomy. Why does any of this matter? Why should we care whether Paul visited Britain or not? Because it fundamentally changes the story of British Christianity. If Paul preached in Britain, then British Christianity doesn't begin with Augustine's mission in AD 597, a mission sent by Rome to bring Christianity to the British Isles. Instead, Britain received Christianity directly from the apostles themselves, independent of Roman authority, predating papal expansion by more than 5 centuries. There's even additional confirmation in the so-called Sonnini manuscript, the long-lost chapter of the Acts of the Apostles, which corroborates Paul's presence and preaching activities in Britain, providing details that support these ancient traditions. The mystery of the missing years wasn't really a mystery at all. Paul was exactly where he said he would be, bringing the gospel to the ends of the earth. It's just that the ends of the earth included a foggy island on the northwestern edge of the known world, where ancient Druids and Celtic warriors would hear the same message that had transformed Jerusalem, Athens, and Rome. Sometimes the most important chapters in history are the ones that get left out of the official record. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe for more great content. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. See you in the next video.